Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 6 months. But this is not a case where investigators are starting with nothing. They have a surveillance image of a masked person outside her home. They have blood belonging to Nancy on the front porch. They have digital evidence showing that devices connected to her suddenly went offline. They have ransom communications sent after her disappearance. And they have 2 dramatically different messages that were released publicly only recently. One claimed Nancy was being held and demanded millions of dollars. Another claimed she had already died. The problem is that investigators have not publicly established who wrote those messages, whether the same person wrote both, or whether the messages came from whoever took Nancy in the first place. And that leaves one question hanging over everything. If the ransom notes cannot be trusted, what actually happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home that night? This is the part of the case that matters now. Not the speculation, not the internet theories, the evidence. Because more than 6 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson area home, she still has not been found. And the closer investigators look at the evidence, the more complicated the case becomes. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared from her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. She was also a vulnerable adult with difficulty walking, a pacemaker, and a heart condition requiring daily medication, according to the FBI. On January 31, 2026, Nancy spent the evening with family. She left for dinner at about 5:32 p.m. and was later driven home by a family member. At approximately 9:48 p.m., she arrived at her residence. The garage door opened. A couple of minutes later, it closed. At that point, nothing publicly suggested that Nancy would become the subject of a massive missing person investigation. But sometime during the early morning hours, something happened at the house. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera disconnected. That timestamp would become one of the most important details in the case. Then, at 2:12 a.m., the camera's software detected movement. Initially, investigators faced a frustrating problem. There was no conventional video available because Nancy did not have an active monitoring subscription. But digital forensic investigators kept working. Eventually, they recovered footage from back-end systems. And that footage showed an individual at Nancy's front door. The FBI later released images and video showing what it described as an armed individual appearing to tamper with the camera. The person was masked. The footage gave investigators something they desperately needed, a potential witness. Except this witness was not someone who could speak. It was a camera recording, and the person captured in it remained unidentified. Then another digital clue appeared. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker application disconnected from her phone. Her phone itself appears to have remained at the house. Taken together, those events created a disturbing sequence. Nancy had returned home. Hours later, the security camera was disconnected. The system detected movement. Then the pacemaker application disconnected. And by the following morning, Nancy was gone. Nancy was expected to attend church that Sunday. She didn't. Someone noticed her absence and contacted her family. At 11:56 a.m., relatives went to Nancy's home. She wasn't there. Her family called 911 shortly afterward. Investigators arrived at approximately 12:15 p.m. and began searching. What they encountered did not look like an ordinary missing person case. Nancy's cell phone was still at the residence. Her wallet was there. Her car was there. Her medications were there. The basic things someone would normally take when leaving home were still inside. And there was another piece of evidence. Blood had been found on the front porch. DNA testing later confirmed that the blood belonged to Nancy. That did not tell investigators exactly what had happened, but it was another indication that Nancy had not simply walked away from her home voluntarily. Authorities began investigating the possibility that she had been taken against her will, and the case quickly became a national story. Because while investigators were searching for Nancy, another development was already emerging. Someone was demanding money. On February 2nd, an email sent to a local television station appeared to be a ransom demand. The sender claimed Nancy was being held. The message demanded money and included deadlines. Investigators began examining the communication. But there was an immediate problem. A ransom demand does not prove that a kidnapping actually occurred for ransom. It proves only that someone sent a message claiming that. Investigators had to determine whether the sender actually possessed information about Nancy that an outsider would not know. They also had to determine whether the communication could be traced. And they had to consider another possibility. Someone could be attempting to exploit the family's fear. That possibility became reality almost immediately. A California man named Derek Kallela was arrested after authorities said he sent his own ransom-related messages to members of Nancy's family. According to the Justice Department, Kallela admitted sending 2 text messages and making a brief phone call. He had obtained family information from a website and had been following the case through television coverage. Most importantly, federal investigators determined that his messages were not linked to the February 2 ransom demand. Kallela later pleaded guilty to 2 counts of harassment using a telecommunications device. That case is important for one reason. It proves that at least one person was willing to impersonate or exploit the kidnapping investigation. So investigators could not simply assume that every ransom communication came from Nancy's abductor. Every message had to be examined separately. And that made the ransom evidence much more complicated. Months passed. Nancy was still missing. Then, in late July, authorities released 2 ransom notes received by local media outlets in the days following Nancy's disappearance. The decision to release them was significant. Investigators were asking the public for help identifying the person who wrote them. They said the communications contained distinctive patterns of word choice, syntax, and phrasing. In other words, investigators were not simply releasing the notes for shock value. They believed someone might recognize the writing style. Someone who had interacted with the writer. Someone who knew how that person communicated. Or someone who had seen the notes before. The contents were disturbing. One note claimed Nancy was alive. It demanded millions of dollars. The writer threatened that Nancy would be killed if the demands were not met. The message presented itself as a conventional ransom demand. Pay the money, follow the instructions, and Nancy would supposedly be returned. But the second communication was completely different. It claimed that Nancy had already died. That contradiction immediately created another layer of uncertainty. If the same person wrote both messages, why would the story change so dramatically? If Nancy was alive, why claim she was dead? If Nancy was already dead, why demand money for her release? And if neither message came from the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance, what exactly were these notes? The investigators have not publicly answered those questions. And that is important. The notes are evidence. They are not proof of the story contained inside them. This distinction has become especially important because of the amount of speculation surrounding the case. A message can contain accurate information and still be fraudulent. A writer can know details about a case from news reports. Someone can obtain information through another person. Someone can deliberately include genuine details to make a false message appear credible. And as the Kallela case demonstrates, people really did attempt to exploit Nancy's disappearance. So investigators cannot ask only, does this sound like a kidnapper? They have to ask, can we connect this communication to the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance? That is a much harder question. The 2 notes released in July remain important because authorities believe their language may provide clues about whoever wrote them. But investigators have not publicly announced that the writer has been identified. And they have not publicly established that the writer was the person who took Nancy. Those are 2 very different things. Then there is the physical evidence. Nancy's blood was found on the front porch. DNA testing confirmed it was hers. That is one of the strongest publicly known physical clues in the investigation. But it still doesn't answer everything. We do not know publicly exactly when the blood was deposited. We do not know publicly how Nancy was injured. We do not know whether the blood was connected directly to the moment she was taken, and we do not know what happened to Nancy after that. Those unanswered questions are critical, because the porch is also where the surveillance evidence becomes important. The camera was disconnected. An individual was captured near the front door, and Nancy's blood was later identified at the residence. Individually, each piece raises questions. Together, they establish that something serious happened at or around Nancy's home, but they still don't reveal the entire sequence. One of the most remarkable parts of the investigation is how close authorities came to losing the surveillance evidence. Nancy's doorbell camera did not have an active subscription that would normally preserve the footage. At first, investigators did not have usable video of the person who appeared near the camera. But digital forensic investigators continued searching for data. They eventually recovered footage from back-end systems. That footage became public in February. The FBI described the person as an armed individual who appeared to have tampered with the camera. The agency released still images and video and asked the public to help identify the person. This is one of the most important investigative developments in the entire case, because the footage potentially gives investigators a starting point. Someone was apparently outside Nancy's home. That person may know what happened, but 6 months later, the FBI has not publicly announced an identification, and that means the footage remains a clue rather than a solution. The digital evidence doesn't stop with the doorbell camera. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker application disconnected from her phone. That detail is significant because the disconnection happened after the doorbell camera had already gone offline. It gives investigators another timestamp, another point on the timeline, another event that can potentially be compared with other evidence. Nancy's phone also appears to have remained at her home. That creates another question. If Nancy left voluntarily, why would her phone, wallet, car, and medications remain behind? Investigators have to consider all possibilities, but those facts are consistent with authorities' belief that Nancy was taken against her will. The important word is consistent. It does not independently tell us who took her. It does not tell us where she went, and it does not prove the motive. It simply adds another piece to the timeline. As the months passed without Nancy being found, attention also turned toward how the investigation was handled. Reports raised questions about the early processing of evidence at Nancy's home, including allegations concerning the blood found on the porch and whether the scene was handled as effectively as it could have been. Those reports have been disputed. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has defended the department's response and its ongoing work. That disagreement should be presented carefully. There is a difference between saying, investigators made mistakes, and saying, reports raised allegations about how certain evidence was initially handled, while the sheriff's department disputed aspects of those accounts. The second statement reflects the uncertainty. And that matters because there is no public evidence establishing that an alleged early investigative problem is responsible for Nancy remaining missing. The case is still active. The FBI remains involved. Forensic analysis continues, and investigators continue following leads. By the beginning of August, Nancy had been missing for more than 6 months. The family has continued to appeal for information. A reward of up to $1 million was announced for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI also offered a separate reward for information connected to her disappearance. But despite the rewards, despite the surveillance footage, despite the blood evidence, and despite the ransom communications, there has been no publicly announced arrest for Nancy's disappearance. That is the reality of the case. There is evidence, there are leads, but there is still no answer. And that is why the ransom notes have attracted so much attention. They seem to offer answers, but they may actually be creating more questions. At one point, an anonymous tip led a volunteer search group toward an area near Nogales, Mexico. The reported tip claimed Nancy's remains had been buried there. But this needs to be stated clearly. That search was not confirmation that Nancy was in Mexico. It was a lead based on an anonymous tip. The Pima County Sheriff's Department said it was aware of reports concerning the search, but had not been contacted by Mexican authorities about it. That distinction is essential. In a case this high profile, a reported search can quickly become a headline that sounds like a discovery. It wasn't. Nancy has not been publicly reported as found. The Mexico lead remains an example of the many directions the investigation has been forced to consider. And now, another theory has entered the conversation. Forensic psychologist Dr. Chris Mohandy recently offered his interpretation of the publicly available evidence. He argued that the case could look more like a burglary or home invasion that went wrong than a carefully planned kidnapping for ransom. He also questioned the authenticity of the ransom notes. His argument is based on the publicly known evidence, including the surveillance footage and characteristics of the communications. But this is an expert theory. It is not the official conclusion of investigators. The FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department continue to investigate Nancy's disappearance, and the ransom communications have remained part of that investigation. So the burglary theory is worth examining. But it should not be presented as solved fact. And there is an important question at the center of it. If this was a burglary that went wrong, what happened to Nancy afterward? The theory would still have to explain the blood, the surveillance footage, the missing woman, the devices that disconnected, the ransom communications, and the fact that Nancy has still not been located. A theory is not an answer simply because it sounds plausible. It has to account for the evidence. At this point, the known facts form a relatively clear timeline. Nancy Guthrie spent the evening of January 31 with family. She returned home at approximately 9:48 p.m. Her garage door closed shortly afterward. At 1:47 a.m., her doorbell camera disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., the camera system detected movement. Digital investigators later recovered footage showing a masked individual appearing to tamper with the camera. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker application disconnected from her phone. Later that morning, Nancy failed to attend church. Her family went to check on her. She was missing. Her phone and other personal belongings remained at home. Blood found on the porch was later confirmed through DNA testing to be Nancy's. Investigators concluded that she had likely been taken against her will. Ransom communications followed. Some communications were determined to be fraudulent. Derek Colella admitted to sending his own messages and later pleaded guilty to harassment charges. 2 additional ransom notes were released publicly in late July. One demanded millions of dollars. Another claimed Nancy had died. Authorities have not publicly established who wrote those notes, and Nancy has still not been found. That is what we know. Now come the questions. Who was the masked person? Was that person actually involved in Nancy's disappearance? Did that person enter the home? Was someone else involved? What happened after the doorbell camera was disconnected? Why did Nancy's pacemaker application disconnect minutes later? What caused the injury that left her blood on the porch? Was the blood connected to an assault? Was Nancy taken from the house alive? Where was she taken? Who sent the first ransom communication? Who sent the later notes? Were the 2 released notes written by the same person? Why would someone claim Nancy was alive in one communication and dead in another? And if the ransom notes were fabricated, why were they created? Were they designed to misdirect investigators? Were they an attempt to exploit the family? Or were they connected in some way to the actual disappearance? Those questions remain unanswered. And there is one more. Why Nancy? That question may ultimately be answered by whatever investigators discover about her life, her contacts, and the circumstances surrounding her home. But right now, there is no publicly established motive. There is something else worth remembering. Investigators almost certainly know more than the public does. That is normal in an active criminal investigation. Some evidence cannot be released because doing so could compromise the investigation. Some details may be known only to the investigators and the person responsible. And some information may never become public unless charges are filed and the evidence enters court. That means the absence of a public breakthrough does not necessarily mean the investigation has stopped moving. It may mean investigators are working with evidence they cannot yet disclose. DNA testing can take time. Digital forensic analysis can take time. Surveillance footage can take time to reconstruct. And a single unidentified person can remain unidentified until someone recognizes a detail that investigators have been asking about for months. That is why the public appeals continue. The FBI wants someone to recognize the person captured near Nancy's front door. The Sheriff's Department wants information that can identify the writer of the ransom notes, and Nancy's family wants the one thing none of the evidence has provided yet: an answer. For the public, this case has become a mystery. For Nancy's family, it is something much more personal. Every day without an answer creates another day of uncertainty. They do not know where Nancy is. They do not know exactly what happened inside her home. And they do not know whether the next tip will finally lead investigators to her. That is why the distinction between evidence and speculation matters so much. A ransom note is not automatically proof. A theory is not automatically a fact. A suspicious person is not automatically a suspect. And a search location is not automatically a discovery. The only thing that can ultimately resolve this case is evidence that connects the pieces. And right now, those pieces remain scattered. A camera, a timestamp, a disconnected device, blood on a porch, a missing woman, ransom communications, a masked figure, and hundreds, perhaps thousands of tips. Some are useful, some are not, some are false. And somewhere within all of that information may be the clue that investigators have been looking for. Nancy Guthrie disappeared during the early morning hours of February 1. More than 6 months later, the mystery has not been solved. The ransom notes have not produced an identified writer. The surveillance footage has not publicly produced an identified suspect. The blood has not revealed where Nancy went, and the searches have not found her. What the investigation does have is a timeline, and that timeline tells us something important. Nancy was home. Someone was apparently at her front door. The camera was disconnected. Movement was detected. Her pacemaker application disconnected. And by morning, Nancy was gone. Everything that happened between those points is where the mystery lives. The ransom notes may be part of the answer. They may be a deliberate distraction, or they may be evidence of something investigators have not yet been able to connect. Until those questions are resolved, the case remains open, and Nancy Guthrie remains missing. If you have been following this case, what do you think is the most important unanswered question? Keep the discussion respectful and separate confirmed evidence from theories that have not been established. And if you want more carefully researched true crime documentaries that follow the evidence, examine the unanswered questions, and separate what is known from what is only suspected, please subscribe to this channel.